12 years ago, my father handed my brother a check for $160,000 and told him the world was his. That same afternoon, he told me to stop dreaming about law school and start thinking about what kind of wife I wanted to be. Today, I am the senior partner at one of the most respected corporate law firms in Chicago. And last Saturday, at my brother's engagement party, his fiancée stood up in front of 75 people and told everyone in that room exactly who I was before I had said a single word. I need to back up. I grew up in a house in suburban Ohio where the rules were different depending on which bathroom you used. My father was a man who believed, with quiet but absolute conviction, that sons carried the family forward and daughters were temporary residents, guests who would eventually be passed along to someone else's household. He never said it cruelly. He said it the way people say things they believe are simply true, the way you'd explain gravity to a child. My brother Marcus was 3 years older than me, and from the time he was in high school, our father spoke about him the way people speak about investments they're confident in. Marcus would go to college. Marcus would go to business school. Marcus would build something. My father said the word build, as though it belonged exclusively to men, as though women's hands weren't shaped for it. I was 17 when I first said I wanted to be a lawyer. I had just finished reading about a wrongful conviction case, a woman who'd spent 9 years in prison for something she didn't do, freed finally because one attorney had refused to give up. I came downstairs and told my parents at dinner, and I remember how the table felt after the words left my mouth. My mother looked at her plate. My father set down his fork. "Lawyers are for people who need to argue for a living," he said. "You don't need to argue for a living. You need to find a man who already has one." My mother exhaled softly. She didn't agree out loud. She also didn't disagree. That was the whole conversation. When Marcus turned 18, my father sat him down and laid out a plan. College paid in full, then an MBA at a school with a name people recognized. He talked about it over dinner like a business arrangement. He used phrases like return on investment and building your foundation. I sat across the table and watched my brother nod along, taking it in the way you accept something you were always told was yours. A year later, when I was 18 and the question of my future had to be addressed, my father's plan for me was shorter. He and my mother sat me down in the living room. He had his hands folded on his knee, which was what he did when he was delivering a verdict. "We're not paying for a 4-year degree for you," he said. "That's not the path for a girl in your situation." I asked what my situation was. "You're smart and you're pretty," he said, as though those were two sides of a math problem that came out to a tidy answer. "Find a good man. Build a life with him. That's the degree that actually matters." I looked at my mother. She looked at the window. I left that living room and went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. I wasn't crying. I was calculating. I had already been accepted to a state school on a partial academic scholarship. I had already looked up the application for a work-study program. I had already researched the income threshold for federal financial aid. I had done this quietly, in the library after school, because some part of me had understood before that conversation that the conversation was coming. I went to college on my own. I worked in the campus dining hall 6 mornings a week. I tutored underclassmen in constitutional law theory before I had even taken constitutional law myself. I had just read the textbook on my own, in advance, because textbooks were expensive and I needed to get full use out of every one I borrowed. I graduated summa cum laude. I applied to law school on a Thursday, got my acceptance letter the following month, and called home to tell my parents. My father said, "I hope you know what you're doing." My mother said, "That's wonderful, honey." Then, more quietly, as though confirming something she already knew, "I always knew you would." I put her in the she knows but she stays category and got off the phone. Law school was 3 years of operating on 4 hours of sleep and the stubborn conviction that I was right about myself even when every piece of my environment was suggesting otherwise. I took out loans. I worked as a research assistant for 2 professors simultaneously. I clerked for a federal judge the summer between my 2nd and 3rd year, and she, a 62-year-old woman, who had grown up being told similar things by similar men, wrote me a recommendation letter that I still have saved in a file on my desktop. I passed the bar on my first attempt. I joined a mid-sized corporate firm in Chicago, and worked myself up over 8 years to senior partner. I specialized in commercial litigation companies, suing companies, contracts in dispute, the kind of courtroom work where the numbers involved had more zeros than most people see in a lifetime. I was very good at it. I was, according to a piece in a legal trade magazine that ran 2 years ago, one of the sharpest commercial litigators in the Midwest under 40. I did not send that article to my father. I did think about it. My relationship with my family during those years was civil, in the way that a cold room can be called comfortable if you're used to the cold. I went home for Thanksgiving most years. I sat at the table and listened to my father talk about Marcus, about his career in finance, about his apartment in New York, about the life my father had funded and then taken ongoing pride in, as though the funding was itself an accomplishment. I smiled. I passed the potatoes. I drove back to Chicago on Sunday and returned to my real life. Marcus and I were not close. We had never been close, exactly, but we had been cordial for most of our adult lives, the kind of siblings who texted on birthdays and made comfortable small talk at holidays. What I knew about him was mostly what came through my parents: that he worked at a financial firm in New York, that he was seeing someone seriously, that my father was very pleased. What I did not know, what none of us knew, as it turned out, was that Marcus had left his job at the financial firm 14 months earlier. He had been asked to leave, to be specific, following an internal review. He had not told my parents. He had spent those 14 months doing something that wasn't clearly defined in anyone's account of it, and telling my father, when they spoke, that things were going great. I found all of this out at his engagement party. The party was held at a hotel ballroom in Columbus my parents had offered to host, which meant my father had taken over the planning with the same certainty he applied to everything. 75 people, a cocktail hour, a sit-down dinner. When I walked in, my father was near the entrance talking to some relatives I recognized from years ago. He saw me come in. He nodded once, the way you acknowledge something you weren't expecting but aren't surprised by, and then he turned back to his conversation. No hug, no glad you made it, just a nod. My mother found me near the bar 20 minutes later. She hugged me properly, held on for a moment longer than usual, and then pulled back and looked at my face the way she sometimes did, like she was searching for something she wasn't sure how to ask about. "You look well," she said. "So do you," I said. "Your father is," she started, and then stopped. "He's glad you came." I didn't push it. I got a glass of wine and found my seat. Marcus was across the room with his fiancée, working the crowd the way he always had, easy smile, hand on the shoulder, that particular brand of warmth that reads as genuine until you know him well enough to recognize it's a performance. His fiancée was standing beside him. I hadn't met her yet. Her name was Diane Chen, and from what I had gathered from the brief summary my mother had given me on the phone, she worked in tech. She was originally from the Bay Area, and Marcus was, according to my father, very lucky. I watched her from across the room for a moment. She was composed in that specific way that high-functioning people are composed at social events, present without being performing, engaged without being loud. She had the look of someone who was used to reading rooms quickly. She caught me looking and smiled politely. I smiled back. At 8 o'clock, the dinner portion of the evening began. My father stood up from the head table and tapped his glass, and the room settled into the particular attentive silence that forms around men who are used to being listened to. He spoke for about 7 minutes. He talked about family, about legacy, about what it meant to raise a son and watch him become a man worth admiring. He talked about Marcus the way he always talked about Marcus, present tense, future tense, always ascending. He used the phrase, "the pride of this family." He used the phrase, "everything I hoped for." He looked at Marcus while he said these things, and Marcus smiled back with the comfortable ease of someone who has been told his whole life that this is what he deserves. Near the end of the speech, my father said, "Tonight, we celebrate my son, Marcus, the successful one, the one who built something real." He did not look at me when he said it. A few people at my table glanced over. I kept my face neutral. I had had years of practice. What happened next? I did not engineer. I want to be clear about that. I had no plan. I had not said a word to Diane Chen beyond hello when Marcus brought her to my table briefly during the cocktail hour. I had not told her what I did for a living. I had not mentioned the case. The case was a commercial litigation matter I had led for the past 11 months, a software company called Arian Technologies, which had been in a contract dispute with a larger competitor that had, in short, stolen their proprietary framework and then buried them in countersuits designed to drain their legal budget until they gave up. The other side had been very good. We had been better. We had settled 2 weeks earlier for $34 million in Arian's favor, and the settlement had been covered in the business press because of its size and because of the nature of the intellectual property issue involved. Diane Chen was the vice president of legal affairs at Arian Technologies. I did not know this when I arrived at the party. My mother had said she works in tech. I had not asked follow-up questions. There was no reason to connect the name Diane Chen in a tech legal role in New York to my client contact at Arian, whose emails I had been exchanging for nearly a year, but whom I had primarily dealt with through calls and, twice, in-person meetings in New York. At those meetings, she had been introduced to me by her title and last name, and I had been introduced to her as Elena Hartwell from Merritt & Associates. We had a professional relationship. We had not talked about our personal lives. After my father sat down, after the applause, after Marcus made his own brief speech about love and partnership and the future, Diane stood up. She said she wanted to say a few words. She said she was grateful to be welcomed into this family. She said she was looking forward to building a life with Marcus. She said all of this with the same composure I had noticed from across the room. And then she said, "I also want to take a moment, because I think it matters, to recognize someone in this room who I didn't expect to see tonight." She looked across the tables. "She found me. Elena," she said, and I felt the name land in the room like something physical. "I don't know if you know this, but your sister has spent the last 11 months fighting one of the hardest legal battles I have ever watched anyone fight. She led the case that just won our company $34 million and, more importantly, protected the work that 63 people at our company spent 4 years building. I would not be standing here with the same company, the same team, or frankly the same sense of what's possible without her." She paused. "I just think people should know what they have in their family," she said. "And this family has something remarkable." Then she sat down. The room was quiet for a moment in the way rooms go quiet when something real has just been said. I did not look at my father immediately. I looked at my mother first. She had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of her, and she was looking at me with an expression I had never quite seen on her face before, not exactly proud, not exactly sorry, but something in the space between the two that understood both. Then I looked at my father. He had aged in the past 4 years, more than I'd noticed at Thanksgiving. He was looking at me now. He had not looked at me in perhaps my entire adult life, like he was seeing something he didn't have a category for. Like the math wasn't coming out the way he'd been running it. Marcus was looking at Diane with an expression I didn't fully understand at first. It was a complicated expression. It was the expression of someone who has just realized that the separate compartments of his life have opened into each other. Because Marcus hadn't told Diane who I was either. He hadn't told her my last name was Hartwell, same as his. He hadn't told her he had a sister at all, it turned out, at least not with any specificity. Diane had known he had a sibling, some vague reference to a sister in Chicago, and she had not connected that to the Elena Hartwell whose name she'd been CC'd on for nearly a year. Why would she? It hadn't occurred to her that the woman she'd spent 11 months working closely with professionally was sitting at a table at her own engagement party. It occurred to her now. I watched her face move through the realization in real time, the small pause, the recalibration, the look she then directed at Marcus that asked a question without words. Marcus looked at the tablecloth. The conversation that happened after, in pieces, over the next hour as people moved around the room and the careful architecture of the evening began to loosen, that conversation was not something I had prepared for. Diane found me near the end of the night, away from the main tables, and we talked for the first time as something other than attorney and client. She asked me why I hadn't mentioned my connection to Marcus's family when we began working together. I told her honestly that I hadn't known she was engaged to him when we started. By the time I knew Marcus was seeing someone named Diane seriously, we were already 8 months into the case, and I had made the professional decision not to introduce personal context into a relationship that was working well on its own terms. I also told her, plainly, that my relationship with my brother was not close, and that I hadn't been certain the engagement was real until my mother called me 2 months ago with the party invitation. She listened to this without interrupting. Then she said, "He told me he was between firms right now, that he was consulting." I said I didn't know the details of his employment situation. She nodded slowly. She was connecting things. I could see the way someone does when information arrives that recontextualizes other information they've been storing without knowing what it meant. "Your father's speech," she said carefully. "Yes," I said. "The successful one." "Yes." She looked at me for a long moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know I was walking into something." "You didn't walk into anything," I said. "You said something true. I don't have any problem with true things." She almost smiled at that. Almost. I found my mother before I left. She was standing near the coat check, and she looked like she had been waiting for me specifically, which I think she had been. "I should have said things a long time ago," she told me. "I didn't perform forgiveness I didn't fully feel. I also didn't punish her for a complexity I had spent years trying to understand. I told her I knew she loved me. I told her I was okay. Both of those things were true." "Your father," she started. "I know," I said. "He doesn't know how to." "I know," I said again. She pulled me in and hugged me the way she had at the beginning of the evening, and this time I let myself stay in it for a moment. My father found me on my way to the parking garage. I hadn't gone looking for him, and I was fairly certain he had spent 40 minutes deciding whether to come looking for me. He was standing just outside the hotel doors. And when I saw him, I slowed down, but I didn't stop moving. He said my name. I stopped. He was quiet for a moment in the cold. He was looking at the ground, and then at me, and then at something in the middle distance that wasn't either of us. "I didn't know," he said finally. "About your work. About the case." "You didn't ask," I said. Not harshly. Just accurately. He made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something that didn't have a name. "I'm proud of you," he said, and I could hear in his voice that the words were real, that they were also arriving approximately 12 years too late, and that some part of him understood that. I stood there in the cold and I looked at my father, this man who had handed my brother a path and handed me a limitation and genuinely believed, at the time, that he was doing right by both of us. I thought about the 18-year-old girl sitting on the edge of her bed calculating loan options. I thought about the dining hall mornings, and the library evenings, and the federal clerkship, and the 8 years of fighting for people's work and livelihoods in courtrooms, while my father's idea of me had stayed fixed in a moment that I had long since moved well past. "Thank you," I said. I meant it. It just didn't fix anything. I drove back to my hotel and I sat in the quiet of my room for a while before I was ready to sleep. I thought about Diane and the expression on her face when the math became clear. I thought about Marcus and the tablecloth. I thought about my mother's hands pressed flat against the table. There's something I want to say about all of this, something I've been turning over since I drove home from Columbus, something I want to get right. I did not win anything at that party. I didn't plan a confrontation and execute it. I didn't rehearse a line or engineer a moment. What happened happened because Diane Chen is a person who names things clearly. And because the world has a way of arranging itself such that the truth eventually occupies the same room as the people who've been avoiding it. What I actually did was leave that house at 18 and build something with the materials I had, which were not the materials my brother was given. And I did it well enough that a woman who had never met my family walked into a hotel ballroom and described it unprompted to everyone in the room. That's the thing nobody told my father when he was forming his ideas about what daughters were for. They didn't tell him that a daughter could become someone that the world talked about on its own, without anyone's help, without anyone's check. They didn't tell him that the limitation he thought he was placing on me was actually just an obstacle, and that some people, when they encounter enough obstacles, simply get very, very good at clearing them. I called my mother the following Tuesday. We talked for almost an hour, which was longer than we had talked in years. She told me some things I hadn't known, small things, accumulations about what she had thought and what she had felt and what she hadn't known how to say across the distance of so many years and so much loaded silence. I listened. I asked questions I had never thought to ask. It was not a resolution so much as a beginning of one, which is the honest version of how these things go. Marcus called me on Wednesday. It was the first time he had called me, not texted, called in longer than I could quickly calculate. He said he was sorry, not for anything specific at first, just generally, which was where he had to start, because the list of specifics was long, and he didn't quite know how to approach it. I let him talk. He told me what had happened with his job, the review, the departure, the months of presenting a version of himself to our father that didn't match the actual version. He told me he had been ashamed, which I believed. He told me he hadn't known what to do with the shame, which I also believed. I did not tell him what to do with it. That wasn't mine to solve. I told him that Diane seemed like a clear-eyed person who valued honesty, and that whatever he decided to share with her was between them, but that clear-eyed people who value honesty generally do better with the truth than with the performance. He was quiet for a long moment. "You sound like a lawyer," he said. "I am a lawyer," I said. He laughed, small and a little helpless. "I know." We stayed on the phone for a while after that, not talking about anything heavy. Just the low-register conversation of two people who have been strangers in a specific way for a long time and are working out, slowly, whether there is something underneath that they might still be able to reach. I don't know how my family's story continues from here. I don't know whether my father's ideas change in any real way, or whether my mother finds a voice she has been careful with for 30 years, or whether Marcus decides to show Diane who he actually is instead of who he wanted our father to see. These things are not mine to determine. What I know is this. I sat in a ballroom on Saturday night, and a woman I had worked alongside for almost a year stood up and said my name, and what came after that was not something I had built or angled for or needed. It was just what was true arriving in the room. I have learned, over 12 years of doing the work that I do, that you cannot litigate everything. Some things you can't argue into shape. Some rooms you can't prepare for. Some fathers you cannot convince. But sometimes, if you are patient, and if you are good, and if you keep doing the work regardless of who is watching, the truth makes the case for you. I grabbed my coat. I went home. I had a brief to finish by Monday morning. If you've ever been the one in your family who was told that your dreams were smaller than they felt, that your ambition was a little embarrassing, that you were reaching for something that didn't quite belong to you, I want you to hear this. Reach anyway. Not to prove anything to the people who doubted you. Proving things to people who doubted you is a losing project. They will always find a way to reclassify your success as luck, or timing, or exception. Reach because the work is real. Reach because the people you will eventually help, the 63 employees at a company whose work you protect, the clients whose futures you fight for, the patients you treat, or the students you teach, or whatever form your particular work takes, those people are real too. And they need someone who kept going. Reach because 12 years from now you might walk into a room and find out, without planning for it, that the world already knows what you built. I would love to hear your story in the comments. And if this is the first time you're finding this channel, welcome. There's always a seat here for people who were told they were reaching too far. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what we put out next, and I'll see you in the next story.